Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the show, End-to-End Innovation, and my name is Matthew O'Keefe. I work for Oracle as a vice president in the ISV engineering group, and I have a great guest today, Ian Corner from Australia. He's not quite with me yet. It's about a 15-hour difference, and he might have a few technical problems, but I thought I'd go ahead and get the show started because basically there's a lot I could describe and introduce folks to before Ian gets here. So I thought I'd just jump into it. So today we're going to talk a bit about how cognitive biases as well as limitations on alternatives can really limit innovation and limit choices that folks make. And so what we'd like to do is really explore really both of these particular aspects. So let's start with the first one, alternatives. So typically in many commercial ventures, as well as really many settings, they limit the various alternatives you consider before you make a decision on a particular design seem to get limited very quickly. It's very often that they get narrowed down to one or maybe at best two. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is biases. Folks have a specific bias to do certain things. We'll talk about those in more detail. But basically, these biases can really limit sort of your overall viewpoint. You can kind of go down a particular narrow chute of reality. And it's important to understand them. It's important to understand how they affect the decision-making process, especially as it affects alternative designs. And it's also important to really come up with some kind of technique to monitor them and be aware of them so that you can counter them and make a much better, much more optimal design choice. So we'll talk about that. The other thing I think that limits alternatives is simply they're viewed as it's too costly to examine too many alternatives at once. And so it turns out in many particularly software projects, there's some techniques. Some of them are associated with what we call Agile or iterative techniques. And these allow you to really much more cheaply and at low risk explore alternatives that could be valid. So it's a low risk way in the sense that it doesn't take as much time. You can limit the amount of time it takes to look at a specific alternative. You can have at each point in time, you can basically stop and look at what are the risk factors you figured out might be involved with a specific approach. You can figure out what the cost might be, or you at least can get a much narrower band on how long it might take you to develop something or how many people or what those resources look like. So these technologies are really helpful to allow you to look at multiple alternatives rather quickly at low risk and relatively low cost. If you add to that techniques to monitor for biases and then filter them out, you're going to do very, very well. So let's talk first about these iterative and agile approaches. So in software engineering, there's a variety of development methodologies. Agile has tended to dominate people's thinking, and Agile certainly is important. But there is also another way to kind of think of it, and that is to sort of come up with a development model that is specifically focused on doing a series of prototypes. And this specific methodology is called evolutionary prototyping. So the idea is that maybe you have a team that isn't as well versed in specific technologies. Maybe you have a team that's somewhat junior. It might be an area that there simply hasn't been a lot of work done, and that's an area where the innovation potential is obviously much higher. And so basically what you do is you get started, you have a sort of an idea of what kind of prototype you might want to develop. You develop a very simple version, and then you stop. Basically, you review what you learned. How long did it take you to develop this? Obviously, there's things you didn't know at the beginning that you then figure out later. Based on that, you can basically determine what the next phase of that evolutionary prototyping design process should be. Hold on one second. My colleague My colleague Ian is struggling a little bit with the link to get in. Let's see, 1 second. So bear with me for just a moment. Okay, try link. So he's having a little bit of trouble getting into the link. Sometimes he works in sites that are pretty secure, so it might be a VPN issue. So we'll see if we can get him in here shortly. But let me give you an example. So this evolutionary prototyping kind of sounds like a big word. Well, I had a pretty interesting experience with it earlier in my career. Started working in file systems, and in particular Linux file systems. In the 90s, there were some new technologies that had come out that allowed for shared storage. One of them was called Fiber Channel. Another was called iSCSI. So there was a lot of interest in developing file systems that let multiple servers work on file systems across this shared storage. When I started, my team really, we were pretty new to the area, didn't know much about file systems, kernel development, or really anything. So we started reading papers on it. We read the established textbooks. We talked to people in the open source community. We came up with a really simple design for our first attempt, and didn't have much in the way of caching. It really ignored some of the hard problems. But we came up with something that worked. We could kind of plug it into, we actually used iterate, an earlier version of Unix and then later switched to Linux. But bottom line is, we had a first version. We wrote some papers on it. We presented them. We got some good feedback. At that time, I was in academia. We got some very good feedback from it. And then from there, we were able to go to the next phase. All right, Ian's here, so I'm going to bring him in. So remember that evolutionary prototyping, multiple phases. I'll come right back to that in a moment. So I'm going to add Ian here. Ian's now in the stream. I'm going to drop this overlay. And there we can see Ian. We can see me. How you doing?
Yeah, good, mate. Sorry, I was struggling with the link.
Hey, no problem.
Too many social media tools to use.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually closed out I had 50 tabs going, so I decided to close them all down and start over.
Cool.
But anyway, so I actually started a little bit started the show without you, Ian.
Cool.
Hope you don't mind.
Thanks, man.
But basically,
Yeah, no
and we'll jump back to that. But hey, thank you for joining, and welcome back. So it's the show. It's been a few months since we've connected, so shame on me. It's been a busy last few months, but we're back in the saddle, as it were. So again, introducing Ian. He is a really senior IT architect in Australia. I met him. He's had a long career. He's kind of in the similar age range to me. So he's had a lot of different experiences, built a lot of different systems, and seen it all. We met when he worked at CSIRO, which is Australia's National Science Foundation plus actual physical real lab
and engineering.
Yeah. So they don't just so they both fund research and do it. Mm-hmm. And Ian had come up with a very really elegant set of abstractions to help workflows associated with data. So typically in our world, what people have done is they maybe done some science experiments. They ran some things on a supercomputer. They stored whatever. It might be some data associated with animals they observed or measured, and it'd be in this file, on that file, on this system and that system. And there was no overarching way to organize it, think about it, to share it, to allow others to reproduce things off it, to persist it over decades. And it's something where I'd been working in high performance computing for that by the time I met Ian, for several decades, and he was like the first person that was really thinking about this problem end to end, and also from what I would consider like a true, what's the high ground? What's the ultimate things we want to do? We want to be able to do the best possible science. We want to be able to reproduce it. We want to be able to allow people to share it. We want to run it on systems that are appropriate, not overly expensive or complex. And we want it to go on so that, when we pass, it's still out there 50 to 100 years from now. Mm-hmm. And your system, that's not the specific focus today, but, the focus of the podcast is really how do you innovate? And what I noticed, Ian, is when I think about all the guests I've had, the consistent thing that every one of you, the one key I don't know what to think. Say the one key mindset that you all have is sort of end to end and a systems viewpoint. So, for example, I had Gary Greider, who runs high performance computing at Los Alamos, and Gary's, he's super well known. He's funded amazing research over decades. He's and again, the key thing is he thinks about the whole system end to end. How does that work?
Yep.
I'm going to have Justin Stottlemyre here from Intuit next month. Justin was really critical architect getting them from on-prem into the cloud, and the processes he followed were very interesting. But again, he has a very end-to-end viewpoint. He knows networking, he knows storage, he knows compute. So as he was making design decisions, he was able to get really ultimately great results. So anyway, so that's a very long introduction, but that Ian, welcome. And
Thanks, mate. Great to be here. Sorry for the delays getting on.
No problem. So what we were gonna talk about today is really sort of two things. So as you kind of work towards this concept of innovating, especially with a systems viewpoint end to end, you want to have, number one, you want to have a way to consider a lot of alternatives quickly at low cost and low risk. And the other thing is you want to be able to filter out as much as possible these cognitive biases that impact human decision making and all of our decision making. Yeah. And so I had actually mentioned a technique I'd use for the first part, which is trying to find as many alternatives as possible. And that's a software engineering concept called evolutionary prototyping. So I had applied it to developing a flat file system for Linux that would allow you to run a file, multiple servers, essentially a single file system, multiple servers across shared storage. It's something that actually was first done with what are called VAX clusters. So the VAX computers that were developed in the 80s and 90s. Yep. But we kind of broadened it to Linux. But when we started, we didn't know any, frankly, we were pretty naive. We didn't really know much about file systems, clustering, or anything. So bottom line is we went through this multiple set of designs. Each of them was kind of time bounded because they were driven. I was in academia, so they were driven by, well, somebody's got to finish a master's or finish a PhD. That takes a couple of years, 2-3 years, and then they move on to the next thing. So they have to write papers. We consider what we did, then we consider the next step. So the beauty of that is you kind of limit the amount of time it takes. You have a stop point. You can reassess the design, the risk factors, and then proceed or not proceed. And you can do that potentially across multiple alternatives. So I don't know, is that when you've been in
I think that is really similar. I think there's some fundamentals. You've got to have the domain expertise in the area that you're trying to innovate. If you don't have domain expertise, then you're going to struggle. I think time, you've got to bound it by time. So you've got to have the time, but you also don't want that to go on forever. And then you've got to have the mindset that each subcomponent of what you're building doesn't need to be perfect. You just got to get it. Let's first of all prove, so some of the work we're doing at the moment, the goal is just to prove that it works. Once we prove that it works and we've demonstrated that, in a sense, the project moves on to maturing it. And so we, take a step back and let's re-engineer those components. But I think that initial step of proving, is a really important one. But yeah, it's the process you described, and I think I've read your paper on that particular outcome that you were just talking about. It really is.
Yeah. But let's see. You can share file slides. You can't verify.
I think I read it quite a number of years ago, but you sent the link more recently as well, and I read through it again.
Yeah. And the source that one of the best software engineering books that I've seen is called Rapid Development, and it's by a guy that was he was at Microsoft for a while. Then he started his own kind of consulting firm that's become successful. And he kind of one of the things I liked about him is that he had sort of done the hard work of reading all of the literature and organizing it, and summarizing it in a really pretty efficient way, so you could read it. Yeah. So I'll remember his name, Steve McConnell. That's right. So I'll put that in the chat. But basically, Steve McConnell's book's called Rapid Development. So anyway, I mean, let me ask you a question, Ian. I mean, in the organizations you've been, you've worked across many different organizations over the years. Kind of what's been the general, when there's a problem or there's some kind of design needed, have you noticed, have they traditionally done like a process where you can look at multiple alternatives sort of equally, or do they tend to like go down one particular
I think,
cognitive path, as it were? What do
I
you
think,
observe?
yeah, my observation is notionally they want to.
Yeah,
Structurally, the organizations might not have the appetite for it.
yeah.
So
And why is that?
yeah, I guess funding is a big one.
Yeah,
That's a constraining factor, but there's also a whole lot of preset conditions in their minds. They may have used a particular technology that they're familiar with, and so perhaps they're de-risking the work in their mind because they know they've done it this way before. They may still be setting out to prove that the way they'd failed before will actually work. I've seen that a few times where people have gone down a path that they believe should work. It hasn't, but they're wanting to go down that path again. So I think there's a whole lot of human factors that if you want to innovate, you have to either lift people up out of those constraints or thought processes and get them into a place where they can go, yeah, let's start with a blank sheet of paper and take it from there. But obviously, there's internal marketing branches of technology companies as well. The technology companies have done a great job of socializing their marketecture internally. And so, and I think the one we've spoken about as well is, shiny new stuff. All of that lends itself to a direction that that doesn't foster innovation, I think.
yeah. I think vendors are very good at that, and I work for one, so I'm not sure we're very good at it, to be honest. But it's no question that what I typically see is there's this thing that people rely on called social proofs, right? So if other people are doing something, or people you respect are doing something, then you get kind of like, well, that must be the one way to do things. And it's, to be honest, sometimes that does save you a lot of work, and it does work in a lot of instances. But I think with complex technology choices, or if you're trying to make a design decision on something that has to survive for a decade or more,
yes,
and there's a lot of hard constraints on performance or security or whatnot, that's a little overly simplistic.
Yeah, I think you're right. So if it's a trivial problem like plugging a USB hard drive into your notebook, then we know how to do that, and no innovation is required here. But if you're working right at the other end of the extreme, the limits of technology, then, and like you say, the life of type that you are either modeling or storing information assets around, if that's in the length of decades or centuries, then you really got to start to ask yourself the question: is a USB key the right place to put that information asset, or do you need a more holistic approach where you've got things like protection against silent data loss and silent data corruption?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you need discoverability and performance as well, right? There's just so many aspects to that. Once you get out of the trivial into the limit of the technology, there's an enormous amount to think about.
Yeah. So I think, in terms of like quick decisions, like, okay, which web browser I should use, or maybe which, smartphone.
Yep.
If my family's mostly using iPhones, and they seem successful,
move on.
Yeah. But if you're designing a supercomputer, you got to deploy a supercomputer that's going to be used for the next 8 years, and it costs 35 or 40 million, and has many different constraints, including budgets.
Budgets, floor space. You want to be able to build the next supercomputer next to it, while preserving all of the information assets, preserving all of the workflows, the provenance around all of that, being able to run the workflows in parallel, so you can demonstrate that the old one and the new one got the same results. There's just so many moving parts in an equation like that.
Yeah. So let's move to these biases and let's talk about them a bit. So just as an introduction, there's a fellow named Daniel Kahneman, and I think he's a Princeton professor. He won the Nobel Prize in economics for this. And what he pointed out is there are these classic human biases that are known to psychology that really have a big impact on how we perceive the world. I first got exposed to them. Scott Adams, the Dilbert creator, had a book, How to Fail at Everything and Still Win Big. And one of the and he's an example of that. But one of the things he said that you should really try to understand is cognitive biases, because you can see them. It's easy. It's actually pretty easy once you understand them to spot them in other people. It's almost impossible to spot them yourself. So we'll talk about how do you handle that particular issue. But the basic idea is Kahneman pointed out that sort of our brains think in two modes. One is like a fast mode. So in fast mode, you're kind of relying on intuition, you're relying on associations and your sensory inputs and kind of your past experience, and then you kind of quickly make decisions. So this is like how we kind of get day-to-day small scale decisions, like driving to work, which way to go, reacting to other drivers, talking to family members and then handling that specific situation, reading the news and then saying, having people we dislike or like and responding accordingly. But when we have to make a big decision, like maybe buying a house or, again, deploying a huge supercomputer that costs 40 million, then we slow things down and we use system two thinking, where we realize the risks and the costs here are very high. And so we have to slow down and really take it, and really try to take a hard look at it. So it's that. The problem is often where you should use the system two thinking, you'll still use system one thinking, which is where these biases live and are very,
very dangerous.
Yeah, they're very dangerous. All right. So I'm going to see if I can share my video file. You know what? I'm still been struggling a little bit with this particular app, StreamYard, and how to show things. So what I'm going to do is, he and I had talked about these biases. So I'm going to just kind of read, walk through some of them. And then what we're going to do is relate them to what we've seen, in IT ourselves. And let's start with self-interested biases. So the idea here is, people, obviously we're all self-interested and you have to be a little narcissistic to just, get through the day, because it's your job to make your, take care of yourself and, make sure you have a good day. So there's biases that we can have that are associated with just what's in our own self-interest. So when you're an executive or you're a decision maker trying to help the team make the best decision, it's something you have to be aware of. And I think in IT, where I've seen this, especially on my when I'm essentially working for a vendor that's pitching a product, there are often times where there will be sort of the hot thing in IT. There'll be some new technique, like maybe it's microservices, or maybe it's a new programming language, or whatever, some new technology. And there seems to be a lot of demand for it, and it's a hot job market. And so you kind of talk to the technical team. It's like, hey, how should we handle this big analytics problem? Or like you said, Ian, when you've got these data intensive workflows, you need to store them someplace. You need to process them. If you've got a vendor that's able to spend billions on marketing and sales, they're going to have an army of people that are able to talk to others. They're going to be able to create a lot of hype. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when you introduced the workflow, data workflow for HPC concepts that we spoke about years ago, and I think that was largely aimed at sitting in underneath people who were biased towards getting outcomes, right?
Yeah.
So there are people out there that they want to get the outcome no matter what the cost or the implications, if you like.
Sure.
What happens? So that framework was really meant to sit under these guys, these people, as a sort of safety net to catch them. So there's people out there that are just so keen to get the answer, they don't care what they use, right? And then at the other end, at the other end of the spectrum, the only answer is the color of technology that they are fully certified in. That is how they think. That is how they move.
Yeah.
Right. And why do these things happen? Right. Some people have careers. Some people have families. You're trying to balance your career against your family. Some people like playing golf with the members who talk, who do the CIO magazine interviews. So you name it, there's a reason for some decision being made. So I guess, back to that original point though, that framework was intended to sit in under and catch everything the people that were biased towards success were doing without getting in their way.
Yeah. I agree. And I think one thing you have to do is people are often this way, but not really aware of it. It's not.
Absolutely.
You don't want to imply it's some kind of nefarious negative.
No, I don't think that. I don't think I've ever seen malevolent actions. It's purely what's in the back of their mind and what they're trying to get to today, what they're trying to get through and what their perception of things is, and that type of thing. So it's not. I don't think ever seen somebody doing it just purely for nasty reasons. It's just life. It's how they've grown up. It's what they've experienced. It's the latest thing in their mind.
Yeah, and it's part of the whole bias concept, right? Which is that you really can't. It's impossible to detect your own bias, and so you really want kind of a process that.
You've got to put a process in place that, like I said, so in a sense, that framework didn't stop them from being who they were.
Yeah,
it just protected the outcome of what they were achieving.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to develop something new and novel, then you've really got to be able to lift all your people up out of whatever it is that's constraining and driving them, and get them to a place of comfort where they can put on the table, hey, I've always wondered what would happen if we tried this, or the product and it is great for what it's doing, but it has all of these limitations, or it free the mind, I think. And if you're doing it as the leader of that team, you've got to free your own mind. You've got to be prepared to listen to each and every challenge that's put on the table. I find it interesting that in the groups that I've been working with recently, there's a lot of diverse ideas, and some of those ideas you look at it and go, well, that's just plain dumb. But if you pursue that idea, it'll lead you places that you otherwise wouldn't have been.
Yeah.
And, some of those places might not make sense today, and you've really just got to pull the pin on the discussion and say, right, let's just put that one on hold for a while, and we'll chat about it next week. After everybody's had time to, think about it. So, freedom of all of these things, that are gnawing in the back of your mind is the key to solving it.
Well, I mean, like a Skunk Works, their culture was pretty much exactly that, right? So this Lockheed Martin had an aircraft design lab that was, I think, started after World War II by a guy named Kelly Johnson, who was also like the chief engineer on, I can't remember some World War II plane that was very successful. It might have been the Mustang, but anyway, he kind of got started that. He was a very young man at the time, like in his 20s, I think. And anyway, so that was kind of the thought, which is, hey, there's no dumb ideas. There's no crazy, anything's worth considering. And they would start, to your point, they'd start with that. What is the outcome they wanted, right? So, in the 50s, we wanted to be able to understand the Russians, what was their deployment of missile silos, right? Well, satellites weren't really, they didn't, hell, I can't remember when Sputnik went up, but there weren't any satellites then. So they needed some kind of aircraft that could fly over. So Johnson built, essentially combined a glider with a jet engine. So he had this U-2 with this amazingly long glider. And that engine, and it could get up to like 90,000 feet, and Russian fighters couldn't get at it.
And the success of that platform has been phenomenal.
I mean, it was used until the lab also built the SR-71, which I have here in the upper corner, right? Which is
I love that. It's a great feat of engineering. I think that's like, I remember, this is an example that I remember where I was explaining reverse cycle air conditioning and heating processes and stuff to a person at a particular site, and talking about how eventually there's too much moisture in the air when it's in reverse cycle. When you're heating internally, you're actually pumping cold from the inside, pumping heat from outside inside. But eventually the outside core ices up, and the guy said, well, why don't you light a fire next to the core outside, right? And I'm just thinking to myself, yeah, great. We'd probably just put a fireplace inside and short circuit that entire process.
Yeah.
Right? Why would you build a fire outside the outside unit? But later on, I was thinking about that and going, well, actually, we do have a source of waste heat, and that waste heat is just bleeding off into the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And so we ducted the waste heat along the back of these units, and so it had an amazing outcome. We cut our energy costs by about 2/3.
Oh wow!
Because this waste heat was just leaking off into the icy night, right? So we ducted it in, and that then improved the efficiency of the reverse cycle heating.
Oh, nice.
And was an amazing outcome. But I had to hear the stupid idea first. I mean, there's no way you would light a fire outside next to those units to keep them warm. That is just nonsensical. But the concept was there. If you had a source of waste heat, this would be potentially a great outcome.
Yeah, very good. Well, cool. All right, so let's keep going. There's another bias called the affect heuristic, and the idea here is basically, bottom line, it's when people fall in love with an idea. So the truth is, when we're evaluating something we like, we tend to minimize its risks and costs and exaggerate its benefits. And then when assessing something we dislike, we do the opposite. Now, I work for Oracle, and so I do this every day, right? It's like, well, if they use Oracle, it's going to be like all of these great things. And then, and I do know Oracle a lot better than I know a lot of other technologies, although I kind of somewhat I would say understand. Okay. But this is sort of a consistent thing that we all do. So whenever you have these strong emotional components, you have to stop and really really assess where you're at. Do you have some thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're working with the SMEs, the subject matter experts and the domain experts in the area that you're trying to innovate, then clearly they've all got those. They've all got specialist knowledge, right? And that they will all tend to, I've done it this way, or the technology works that way, or this is the vocabulary that describes the technology, so that's the only way you can think, right? Back to the architecture example.
Yeah.
The vocabulary is defined in the architecture almost to constrain your thinking and point inwards at that architecture, no matter no matter what where all directions lead to the architecture. So vocabulary, I think, is a really strong part of that bias. Right. And I think one of the things for me personally is I hate all technology equally. If we could get rid of all technology, life would be better. In general, that's my bias. But so unless you can show me the business outcome that you're trying to achieve, I'm not going to recommend a technology.
Yeah.
For years, and this is a long time ago when computers were relatively new, someone would say, tell me the computer I should buy. And I said, well, how much money you got? And then $3,500–4,000. Yeah, cool. So just withdraw that from the bank as cash. Why would you do that as well? Because the next step is going to be you're going to take it out in your backyard and burn it. And when you're happy to burn that amount of money, then I'll tell you which computer to buy. So that's my that's my perception or my approach to technology. So I think that helps me look at all of these specialist recommendations and say, yeah, that's great. That's a brilliant technology. It does things really elegantly. It's worthy of keeping in the toolbox of things that we've got. But show me how that gets you to a business outcome.
Yeah.
Show me the way the business makes money out of this or achieves the outcome that they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and a good a colleague who is often a guest on this podcast, and Randy Olinger works for a big healthcare
Yeah.
health insurer. Let's just describe them as a big health insurer. So one time we worked together quite a bit. So I'll sometimes work with him on products and stuff. But at one point I accused him of hating the company that I worked for at the time. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh no, I hate all companies equally. I don't hate anybody more than the rest of them." And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, right? Which is don't fall in love with a company. Understand its strengths and weaknesses, right?
And absolutely. It's all just tools in the box. Or farm animals on the farm, right? It's not something to be fixated on any one thing. Now, clearly you need the specialists in all of those domains, or you won't link it together in an integrated outcome. So there's another thing on this particular topic. It's, what business outcome are you actually trying to achieve, right? Because quite often your biases are driven by the fact that the outcome's not well defined.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So in this whole process, my starting point is, okay, show me how you're going to do this on a piece of paper with a pencil and eraser. You show me your workflow on a piece of paper with a pencil and eraser. Oh, I don't know how that's going to work. We've got to find the technology that does it for us. And it's like, well, if you can't describe the outcome, the computer's not going to describe it for you. Yeah. You're just going to fall into a technology trap, having something that, might not even be necessary, let alone useful.
No, absolutely. Yep. Very cool. Very true. Very true. All right, let's look at our next bias. So, and we talked about this earlier, which is when you get a recommending team and everybody's singing from the same sheet of music, right? There doesn't appear to be any dissenting opinions, and sometimes that can be genuine, but if there's very little diversity in the background, or there's like one prima donna that runs everything, it's maybe not surprising. But if there's an absence of dissent, that does tell you that's a bit of a red flag. It's like, was there a suppression of what the alternatives could be? Have you seen this before in your, in kind of your career?
I think as Australians, we're naturally objectionable, so it doesn't happen too much. I think where the problem comes on, in my experience, is the heroic assertions made by senior executives. I think it's not so much down at the technology level. There's always plenty of debate, and plenty of objection, and sometimes it's about things that really don't matter. Are we going to use N make or G make? No, just move on. Right. But sometimes it's about stuff that takes months to resolve and think through, and the solutions aren't always obvious. So there's always, I think, with this basic Australian workforce, you always get plenty of perspectives, and generally everybody will speak out. Like I said, you get the outliers who seem to be dislocated from both time and this universe and come up with really peculiar things, and that's good. Pursue those as well. But the biggest threat to all of that I've always seen is the heroic assertions made by management. Where they've overlaid the picture. And I think we were talking about this earlier in this week, where you get a strong voice or an authority in the organization. This is the technical direction, and it's like, it's probably going to unwind the motivation of the specialists, and probably lead you down that path of architecture from where there's no escape. Right.
Yeah. That's very, I think that's a big, that's a big reason for this to happen, which is, like you said, it's pretty clear what the top executive wants. There's a certain outcome, and then everybody works backward to, I think that's not uncommon in the US. Hopefully it's good to hear it's less common in Australia.
I think we suffer from that disease really badly.
Oh, do you? Okay.
Yes. I think that would be one of the, one of the top stifling effects of innovation. Or you can take innovation out and you could replace it with lost opportunity.
Okay.
Right. At the moment I'm heavily involved in the research space, And research is, what's the next big thing that we achieve?
Yeah.
Well, if you're throwing away the opportunities to achieve, that's probably not the business outcome you want, right?
Yeah.
You want to be fostering opportunities to achieve.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
So you get a senior individual in who, is biased to a particular way of thinking. That might be great, but also could be pretty detrimental.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Absolutely. Next one is saliency bias. So the idea here is that sometimes folks will see like an analogy, right? They'll maybe in a more broader context, they'll consider acquiring a company. They're considering acquiring a company, and maybe a peer company acquired a similar company, and then they had great results. Or I think it's often true. I see this in IT when there's some hot new thing like microservices and a company like Netflix, right? Well, Netflix, all companies are cool for a while and then they're no longer cool, right? So I think that might have gone off the cool train track at the moment. But anyway, so Netflix was cool, and I remember I looked at this whole flow of like Netflix, technical teams discussions of microservices. And it just started with, the old style, just running everything off a single relational database is so broken. So we're going to do this other thing. And, bottom line is everybody, okay, they seem to be very successful with it and they scaled and it's a cool app we all use. So everybody thought, well, it must be related to me. I should be using microservices because, if it worked for Netflix, it should work for me. But if you think about Netflix, it is very unlike most enterprise, businesses, right? It's this sort of
absolutely.
read-only workflow, stream it in, stream it out. It's a very unique application. But anyway, any thoughts on that or what you've seen?
Yeah, I think like I always come back to, it's just, a microservice is just a tool in the toolbox. What is the business outcome you're seeking? What's the workflow of that business outcome? You need to be able to draw that workflow of your business outcome on a piece of paper with a pencil and eraser at least to start off with. And then the question is, what do you plug into each one of those things? And then I think there's another problem in that space. And that's, again, it's probably vocabulary. We've just concluding 30 months of looking into remote visualization because the degree to which the specialists want to do visualization is extreme.
Okay.
And there's significant limitations in the network. And then some of these visualization tools are written in language. I think you've just locked up. Oh, no. Back. We just dropped out for a bit there. Yeah, I think we just dropped out.
I can hear you though. The audio is good.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so if you look at what the specialists are trying to achieve at the business end, they're running extreme levels of visualization across vast distances. Often the applications are written in legacy tool sets, which are using quite old protocols. Nobody knows how to rewrite those or has the budget to rewrite them. And so the problem we had there was everybody saw remote visualization as a singular outcome.
Okay.
Where in actual fact, it's turned out to be a matrix of outcomes. You've got a list of applications that can run to a particular resolution on particular sites.
Okay.
Right. So it's not, so we had to get to that ability to reshape the reader's mind of the visualization solution. It's not one solution, it's 4 solutions.
Okay.
And those 4 solutions work to a particular extent at particular sites for specific applications.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. And now if there's a one size fits all, that's just never going to work. Right? Because at the extreme end of the technology solution, it's prohibitively expensive.
Yeah.
And, maybe 5 or 10 projects will opt in for that and fund it, but you wouldn't be able to put 3,000 desktops out like that.
Okay.
Right. So you've got to have a sliding scale and you've got to have an open mind, and understand that those words mean different things to different people in different places at different resolutions using different applications.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's this, going back to your example, if you're in love with microservices or you're in love with this visualization technology, then you're going to whitewash, 90% of your opportunities. And this is another, pathway to lost opportunity.
Yeah. And that's part of, that's the kind of, there's just cognitive bias in general is you filter when reality's coming at you, you'll filter it so it fits that model you have, right? If you're a particular political figure you don't like, then you'll tend to watch news about them that's negative. If there's positive about them, you'll go, well, that's silly and that's ridiculous. And the truth is, it's sort of like if there's a particular vendor you like, maybe it's Snowflake, Mongo, or Oracle, you'll listen when an Oracle person speaks and you like Oracle. Oh, I get it. Well, that Mongo, whatever, but it's not really. It's to your point. It's like, well, what's the business outcome? Maybe Mongo is the right answer for the specific business outcome you want.
I think that's exactly it. Your database example. You could take what we've just done for the last 30 months in visualization. You could apply it to databases.
Yeah.
Right. You could do exactly the same and come up with the exact a similar matrix, different sliding scales, obviously. I love Oracle. I love what Oracle's achieved in their technology. I've worked with it for decades and think that, definitely made my life easier, and was quite amazed at what had been achieved in, transaction consistency, point in time recoveries, all of that amazing stuff. But, 90% of the time or 99% of the time, it's, Postgres, because that's all the business outcome needs. We've only got 500,000 records. They're all related to each other. Postgres has been doing this for 3 decades. This is good. Move on.
Absolutely.
So, it's a sliding scale. But, I suppose databases is the exact same sort of place where remote viz is. People have their perception of what remote visualization is. People have their perception of what they like in a database. But at the end of the day, they're an n-dimensional problem. That you've got to take back to what is the business outcome that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk. So I worked in database engineering for a while in product management, and when you talk to like the executive vice presidents, the guys that report to Larry Ellison, their view was like, well, Postgres and MySQL and MariaDB, these are fine products. They're based on SQL standards, and pretty much they agreed with you, which is like, okay, use the right tool for the job. And if Postgres can get the job done for you, there's a lot of, you don't have to license it. You have the source code. There's a variety of alternatives for support, et cetera, et cetera.
And when the business that's using Postgres becomes successful and gets to a scale that they need Oracle, it's not a hard transition.
Yeah. Now, I have to tell you, these same EVPs, I'm not going to name the company. There was a particular company they really, really didn't like. And the reason they didn't like it was, well, part of it was that this company was quite successful against us. And what they didn't like was their feeling was that this company was claiming, well, it wasn't based on standards, so it wasn't following SQL standards. And then it was making claims that were frankly quite outlandish relative to. But the truth is they were getting traction and they had a massive sales force and developers loved them. And, developers loved them, back to that affect
bias.
And then there aren't enough people like you and I in the room. But don't get me wrong.
That's right.
That company's, it's very clear that company's technology was quite useful in many different things. So very good. All right. Let's. We've talked a little bit about like have credible alternatives been considered? So we've kind of been beating on that. Let's see. Here's another one that's pretty interesting. When you're making a decision, think about what information you would want like a year from now, and can you get more of it now? And I can give you an IT example. Huge healthcare company, or health insurer, and they were building a system that basically ingested all of these healthcare records, doctor's visits and hospitalization and patient histories, et cetera. And it was this big data lake. And then they were going to try to get reproducible insights on that could drive future care. And it ended up being kind of a worst case in some ways decision-making. It was just people picked a series of like hot things that were out there. Here's this hot database and here's this hot code repository, and here's this other hot thing. And there wasn't really much design. There wasn't looking at like extremes of there wasn't like any limited prototyping at the start. There wasn't consideration of alternatives. And they got down the line spending $1 billion. They acquired one company for $1 billion with some of the technology. Then they spent another $1 billion. And it's kind of sad because it comes back to your point about business outcomes. You start with that business outcome. It's clear they had an abstract business outcome. I think to a certain extent, what they didn't have is something that was like a business outcome that was narrow enough that they could actionably design against it. And then have back to that iterative idea. Well, let's instead of trying to solve everything at once, grand unified physics theory, let's look at a specific type of cancer. And all we're going to do is get every piece of data we can find and clean it up, make sure the data is right and normalize on, I don't know, colon cancer or something else.
Yeah.
And then we're just going to, and we'll have a small base of patients and let's just get it to work for that. That would be your first phase of your evolutionary prototyping. Yeah. And you could design that, and then you could like puff up maybe the size of it, create a bunch of artificial patients, try to make it go up by a factor of 100. And then see how the design reacted. I don't know if you were at the Justin, like I mentioned, Justin Stottlemyre is going to be on next month, the Intuit CEO. He worked at a company. He worked at Shutterfly, and he had this awesome presentation at the mass storage conference that you were, or the massive design storage conference that you presented at. And it was about, he called it the 1,000 times rule, right? When you're designing at that level of scalability, if the business outcome requires that much scalability, it really changes all the way you think about the design from the get-go. Anyway, I've sort of been talking a lot, but what's your take on that?
No, I agree. There is, so I guess in a sort of enterprise sense, you can pick and choose tools and cobble them together, and that probably works. But once you hit the scale issue, you've got to step back and test each and every brick that you're putting in the wall. Yeah. You've really got to get your foundations right. And so what you said made total sense to me on the medical example, because we've always picked some early adopters that have got a problem that can't be solved, work with the early adopters to create that general framework which treats their problem. Throw it away a couple of times so that the framework develops. I think that one of the frameworks we're working at the moment, it's on major release 4 and minor release 3, and it's been thrown away. It's been thrown away probably 10 times over the last 4 years. And I'm still happy to throw it away a few more times. But that's been using early adopter feedback, right? Cool. But if back to what you're saying, if there's a trivial enterprise problem that you're solving, then grabbing a tool off the shelf probably doesn't matter. But if you're trying to do anything at scale, then you've really got to work hard at each little bit, all the way up the stack, to make sure that it's running, with the least latency, the greatest ability to scale out, and the least amount of resource use. So part of the just going back to the visualization example, like I'd said to the team while they were doing that, I wouldn't have any of the fancy GNOME or KDE desktop stuff, all that shiny animation. You've got to turn all of that off, right? And there was tremendous resistance to that, and the work was still struggling. And so I got some network tracing done. In fact, I did the network tracing myself, and 99% of the packets were shiny. They were shiny packets. They weren't business outcome packets, right?
Oh, okay.
So, you got to take every decision at the extreme ends of performance seriously. You can't just say, well, everybody's using GNOME, so let's use GNOME, or I love KDE, so let's use KDE. You got to look at it. Well, what impact is that having on the fact that we are running extreme scale? Both those products use more memory, and they're lovely products. They're really usable. And for a desktop, you would probably always choose one of those, maybe something else. I'm a bit of a minimalist, so I'd like to go back to TWM maybe.
Excuse me.
But when you look at it, okay, so these things use a lot of memory. They use a lot of CPU, and then once you put them out on the network, they're going to induce a lot of latency-based problems.
Yeah.
Right. Just as an example of one thing in that continuum of stuff that you need for your extreme.
And in this project I mentioned, they use GitHub as a repository, but they didn't actually run like small tests on like how does it do with really large files, which these specific medical files were actually quite large, and it did terribly. It couldn't possibly scale. It was one of those, like, if you'd known that at the beginning, if they pulled that information in, they probably would have known that this thing was. It couldn't.
Yeah. I've seen some projects fail really, really badly over the last couple of decades like that, where, and I think, I sort of call it the numbers game. It's really a numbers game. And the example I use is nobody's visualized a gigabyte of data.
Yeah.
Right. And so once you put the visualization in front of them, so just imagine, the gigabyte of data is a box trailer. Full of gravel that you've got that your partner has told you is, Saturday morning comes around and, your partner's going, well, I've got a ton of gravel for you to, shovel around the back of the house. And they go, okay, a wheelbarrow looks okay. And so you get that done. And then, fast forward to the next weekend and, I don't have a gigabyte of gravel out there. I've got a terabyte of gravel out there. And you look out the bedroom window and there's 54 trucking dogs sitting there clogging up your residential street. Your wheelbarrow doesn't look so smart anymore, right?
Yeah.
It's a numbers game, and if the numbers are small, and they're always going to be small, then your decision, you can probably get away with any decision. But once you get to the extreme end of decision making, then it can become a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, the next one, halo effect. So this is a little bit similar to the affect heuristic. The idea here is it happens when you see a story that's simpler and more emotionally coherent than, frankly, the actual reality. And so what happens is people associate success, with particular personalities and their leaders. So, Lee Iacocca was associated with Chrysler's success back in the, I think it was the 70s and 80s. Jeff Bezos with Amazon, obviously. So you start to think, well, these people, wherever they go, they're going to be, all the success was driven by them. And there's kind of a similar thing with companies, right? They're companies that are deemed excellent. And pretty much all companies have this period where they have these halos. For a while, it was Google. Back in the 90s, 80s and 90s, it was Oracle. And then bottom line is, once they're sort of viewed as like they're sort of, there's like this assumption that they can really solve any problem. Bottom line is, it can really affect, they can get overly associate the success, of that company, and just assume if they behave the same way as that company, they're going to get the same success. And
I think, I don't know whether I've ever mentioned this to you, but you helped me tremendously, I think, in 2014 when we first met, because I'd been struggling with this problem, and the halo effect was coming from the way the Americans always do things, and this perception that you guys were leading the way, and this is the way things should be done. Corner, why are you doing it differently? Right. Yeah. But you stepped in and you sort of ripped the covers off some of these really large systems where, the claim was they were running, 250,000 cores and all this sort of stuff, or whatever it was back then. And I think your comment was, well, when you talk to the people behind the scenes, they're not running anywhere near at that scale, and the occupancy of the system isn't that high, and these are the challenges they're facing. I think that was part of the discussion we had, and that really, that really ripped that halo off for me, and made it much easier for me to stand my ground against a lot of people that were saying, well, we should just be copying what these guys are doing rather than, what I've always said. Let's look at the business outcome, and what sits in under that business outcome to get us there in the cheapest, fastest way.
Yeah, and there's another word for it. It's called cargo culting. So, do you remember? Are you familiar with with cargo cults? So
no, not at all.
you should, you're Australian, so you'll like this. So back in World War II, as the Americans, as we kind of hopped and skipped our way across the Solomons, the Philippines, and whatever, the Marianas to Japan.
Yep.
What would happen is, we'd fly. There'd be some island that the Japanese weren't at, right? And we could just like fly in or land there, and then we'd build runways and basically airports, and we'd have all these buildings, and they'd have all sorts of air conditioning, and they'd have all these magical things coming out of them, and you could get healthcare, and then they'd move on, right? So they do all this stuff on an island, and then we just move on to the next one and leave it all there. So the natives didn't really understand, what the heck is all this technology do? It was like a halo effect on what these Americans were doing, and Australians in some cases, of course. Yeah. And so they would actually build like airport type buildings with bamboo.
Yes, I have heard this. Yes.
And I mean, this is exactly what happens in technology. It's like, Netflix built this microservices thing, and it looked like they did such an amazing job. And you try to, sometimes, don't get me wrong, often it works, and there are a lot of strengths of microservices. But a lot of times, I think the worst case was in like data lakes and big data. It's like, we'll just get all this data, we'll throw it all together, and we don't really have a schema. It's not really normalized. We don't really know if it's that great. But if we apply an AI technique to it, because Facebook, increased their ad revenue by 50%, then magic will happen. And it's really almost that level.
We've had that one so many times. Data lakes used to be data warehouses, and it was all about unstructured data. And I think that's really where my piece of paper, pencil, and eraser came from. There was a data warehouse I was working on in the mid-90s, and I'm looking at this going, so you don't have a schema that you're importing it to. All your data sources, you're not normalizing them. How's this going to work? And but I think your example is right. It's like, okay,
you got started quickly,
the money got spent fast too.
Right.
The margins were up for the quarter. But I think your example of what happened on those, what did you call it? Cargo
cults.
Cargo cults. Yeah, I think that's really what it is, right?
The cargo plane would come in, you'd build up, and then magic would happen, healthcare, food, planes.
Nobody knew really how it was going on.
But it's exactly what you're saying, which is there's so to give the natives credit, they had a business outcome, which is they wanted more, they wanted to be healthier, they wanted to have these benefits of the technology, and so if they had a way to draw, they just were missing that. I want this particular outcome, but I can't connect that outcome to all this other stuff because I don't have the framework, the thought framework. I don't understand science. I don't, whatever. They just had that limitation. Now, of course, they had a lot of, these same natives had a lot of other skills, like they could relax. They weren't as
I had a life.
They actually had a life, unlike us modern, people that live in modern civilization where we're just running from the next meeting to the next.
Yeah, I think speaking of preconceptions in that space, preconceived ideas, there was a pretty major cyclone or whatever they call it out in the South Pacific that wiped out a lot of Vanuatu. And the world responded, right? The world was sending all sorts of stuff to them, none of which they needed because that country just is so self-sufficient. They have a tremendous way of life. You can pretty much walk through the bush and just drink out of any river or creek that's running. There's food everywhere. I don't know how you would ever starve. There's food growing, everywhere on the side of the road. Wow. But the perception was from the West that all of their infrastructure is gone, their roads are broken up, this is terrible, and it's great. There was a lot of good outcomes that came out of the West, providing all of the relief funding. But at the end of the day, the perception didn't align with the actual reality.
That's like a reverse cargo cult, So we're like
It is.
It's reverse cargo culting.
Yeah, we didn't need it. Thanks for bringing it. There were some pretty amazing stories that came out of those times with some of the expats that live over there and spoken to them. But
That's
yeah,
insane.
your perception. I honestly don't think there's any people starving in that country just because of the excess of food that, everywhere you go, food is just growing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Say, I have to mention something about this halo effect, especially around big data, right? So, these cool new things came out of Google, like MapReduce and this, that, or the other, right? Or cool open source Presto. And by the way, again, each of them can play a role, and you don't have to license them; they're free. You can add to the development, etc. There's certainly advantages, but basically, what got me though is just, it's like, you do understand if things aren't normalized, downstream that can be a big problem. And
if you don't know what you're looking at,
how
can you make a decision out of it?
Yeah, and it's funny because there's a guy that was on the broadcast last year. And he's a CTO for a cloud analytics firm that does commercial real estate. And literally, I've told you this before, his name's Ron Beckerman. And Ron he's a machine learning specialist. He was a professor at, Technion in Israel. He's a very, very famous guy. He's written many papers on hardcore, machine learning type things, but he's very business outcome focused. And so for him, the biggest problem is he wants to create this database and then build a graph so you can figure out, like, are these buildings related, and then how much that helps you understand, like, how much this building is worth. But for him, the number one most important thing is, like, who owns that building? And I need to know if there's 20 different ways to say JP Morgan Bank. I need to know what those 20 are if I'm going to make this thing really work. Yeah. And at one point he asked me, how many names, aliases do you think there are for JP Morgan? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe dozens. And he said like 10,000.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was watching a documentary on this yesterday or the day before, and it was like 20,000 was the number they were banding around. And so that's insane.
So that's what he spends his machine learning on. He uses machine learning to normalize. So again, driven by business outcome. The most important thing is that to make that, his graph of commercial real estate work, it's imperative that you know who owns which things. And, so that bottom line became a big thing.
Yeah, I can think of some tax departments that would be really interested in that machine learning.
Exactly.
They'll find who's earning the dollars and extract the money. Hey, we got time for a quick, I need another coffee if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem. I you know what? I think I have to be a little careful because this broadcast, I can't remember how long I can go over. Why don't you get your coffee? So we'll take a quick break, and then let's take a 3-minute break, and then let's go for another 15. And I think I can continue to go. If we get stopped, oh well. I think we'll still have the recording and we can put that up. Okay. Yeah, so we're gonna pause for 3 minutes and then we'll be right back.
See you soon.
I'm gonna put the overlay on here. I can play some music. Let's see what they've got here. right. Okay. Let's get back to
We're back at it.
last 10 minutes here. Let's go to, I got to hide this banner. Excuse me. Sorry. I'm a little slow on the uptake here. All right. Cool. All right. So the last two, I think, are sort of at the bookends, but basically the last two biases you want to factor out are, is the base case overly optimistic, and is the worst case bad enough? So are you, maybe let's start with the second case, which is, have you thought about like all the bad things that can happen? And to me, that's something that's actually, if you have the right attitude, it's actually kind of fun, right? And it's pretty popular in software engineering. How do you decide, do this idea of like understanding risks and explicitly managing them? And I think it started in the 80s in software engineering, and it ended up being pretty successful. But do you see that much in your projects? Do people ever like go through like, here's the risks, that things that could go wrong? In general, I don't think management's comfortable with it. It's almost,
they're challenged. They're challenged by it. Whenever I talk about all of the risks, so we're at a particular point in our project timeline. Beyond that point, there's another journey that we've got to start. And I sat down, I think 15 or 18 specialists a few weeks ago, and we called out the 104 risks between where we're headed to and where we need to get beyond that. And management do definitely struggle when risks are raised. And I think the outcomes I see in general are, well, there's a really unfortunate outcome. Well, let's wait until we realize the risk and we've got an issue, and then we'll deal with it then.
Right.
That's a way to kill your project off very, very quickly. Really what you should be doing with your risks is retiring them, like you said multiple times. So here's a small test case. Let's understand what the solution to that is, and then grow that out. And okay, that risk is now retired. Rather than, we bought all of this shiny stuff, and that risk's now realized and the money's been spent. So definitely that. The other way I see it playing out, I haven't seen this much, but I was pretty disturbed when I did see it. With Agile and sprints. There was one project manager that I worked with, which was, we called him the king of de-scoping. Because if there was anything that really, really needed to be achieved, but was going to take more than the time of the sprint, it came out of scope. So 18 months later, that thing that you really, really need is still sitting on the back burner. And a 3-week sprint was never going to solve a 6-month problem. Right?
Sure.
So
I mean,
but the project reports always look good.
The
sprint reports always look perfect, right? Everything we set out to do got done because this thing was always de-scoped.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Because you went from this opposite extreme in enterprise software. So that was, I think, a response to these projects that were unobservable, right? They just would start and then would waterfall in darkness, and they would go for months and months and months, and then something would pop out, and it wouldn't be what people would really wanted, and it took a long time. And so, I mean, that was a benefit of Agile, but I think people are missing the point to your business. I mean, we're going to sound like broken records here, but the business outcome is, you wanted that feature to work, that 6-month thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's nice that all your sprints, met their defined objectives, but that's the whole point of sprints, right? So it's about like, you got to get that thing done.
So you can leverage sprints, I think, for prototyping, and that can be helpful.
So it's like an evolutionary prototype. You want to get to that 6-month thing. So do a series of sprints, but you better everything has to be driven. And sometimes, look, when you're doing research, it's like one of the things McConnell said is like, look, he quoted Seymour Cray. He said, everybody thought Seymour was crazy, like a lunatic, right? He's always building these like crazy computers. But he said that he tried to never innovate in more than 2 dimensions, I think, or two particular major things. He always tried to restrict it, because then he just couldn't. And so So the bottom line is, people don't understand that you can't time bound. There are certain kinds of innovation you can't time bound. They're not. You can't. You can come up with an idea and maybe time bound the first step of evaluation, and then the next step and the next step. But you're essentially doing research, not like strictly development.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Or
yeah, no, absolutely. I was thinking a couple of things that just you triggered in my mind around just innovating in one or two dimensions. Don't bite off more than you can chew.
No, it's really true. I mean, and like, look, Oracle developed this thing called Exadata, right? And and Apple did iPhones, and and Lockheed Martin, the Skunk Works guys did these series of planes, and they take a long time to develop.
Absolutely.
I mean, iPhone didn't just appear. There was the iPod first. So the iPod helped them kind of refine some things. But, these long-term integrated, really powerful designs just take, they take
you've definitely got to overlay those two approaches.
Yeah.
Right? You've really got to, so we're rolling out infrastructure at the moment in an agile manner.
Yeah.
And anyone who's rolled out infrastructure knows that that's nonsensical. You can't roll out. You don't build train track following agile methodology. But the thing we've done in the back end of this for the last 2 years to make this work is we've modularized everything. We've done all of the testing. We've got all of the bits and pieces down into small, repeatable chunks.
Yeah.
Right. And so now agile and having that reporting structure and is making a whole lot more sense.
Yeah.
But we're not pure agile, right? Where there's daily stand-ups, there's stuff changing all the time. We're not in that strict framework, but we're following the basics of the methodology.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fine technique for keeping it it's highly observable. You can get things done,
and this is why we're using it.
Yeah.
But on the back end of this, there's been 2 years of hard slog to get us to the point where this now makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't know what to put into Agile until you've done that really hard work.
Yeah.
It's hard to time bound, frankly.
Yeah.
To be honest, that was one of the nice things about using that evolutionary prototyping in academia, because you weren't time bound, right? The students were relatively cheap. I mean, they're much cheaper to have to be a student than to have like somebody fully loaded staff person in one of your organizations. So that was such, and bottom line, it was just it had that benefit. What about overly optimistic? Now, I personally tend to be way too optimistic in general. I have to kind of force myself to be pessimistic, but
I think I don't know. So there's multiple ways to think about that. I think my parents sort of always said, aim high, and if you only get halfway there, that's good. Aim low and always succeed. It's not going to work so far. So that's one way of doing it. But I always assume stuff will go wrong, and until I've got a repeatable prototype, even if I've done it a decade before, and until I've got this decade's repeatable prototype, I'm assuming that it's not going to work. And anything like that just adds stress and creates chest pain. So I tend to want to resolve all of those things and see the resolution.
Yeah, I think I noticed that about you. So you have a temperament that I think is good, very good that way. And I'll tend to be like, I'll think like 5 steps ahead. And then in my head, it's already done. I used to frustrate my employees and my students with this, because it's like, oh yeah, we kind of figured it out. Now you guys just go work on the details.
Yeah.
Like, wait a minute, those details are like a ton of research, but yeah. So very good.
I think it's good to have both things. You've got to be optimistic that we're going to get there, right? Yeah. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that you've got to resolve. Yeah, a lot of unknowns.
Yep, absolutely.
Semi unknowns in some cases.
That's right. So, let's take another few minutes. How would you, if you think about this at an organizational level? I mean, this paper, and I'll put the when we put this up on the final recording with notes on YouTube, I'll put the paper. You can find it online. But basically, it's called "Before You Make That Big Decision" by Daniel Kahneman and 2 other authors. They deal with the issue of like, how do you make this a process within an organization? And they have a variety of recommendations. One of them was, well, you can have a person who's sort of the guy that person, female or male, who sort of runs the process of, actually runs the process and makes sure that these tough questions are asked. But they also suggested that person be rotated because it could be, it could be career limiting to be viewed as Dr. No, and continue to do that. They also mentioned injecting the diversity of views, mix of skills into the process. This is something you and I talk about a lot, which is, it's rare to have individuals that really deeply understand like all networking, storage, compute. Those are the people, like I said, Justin is somebody who I think has repeatedly done amazing things because he has that. People like you, to a certain extent, I think also Mike DeClercq. It's pretty rare. It doesn't happen. It's just it's a set of individuals that are just constantly curious and are always getting themselves in situations so they're learning. But any final comments or thoughts on like how do you make an organization, how do you make it more amenable to this, iterative design and really filtering biases? Any thoughts?
I think that what you've just flagged is a number of good steps. You definitely need someone that owns the end-to-end problem, but has enough breadth and depth of knowledge to call into question each and every element of what's been done, pull things out that you don't need. So I think you need that. The organization has to want to be shaped that way. So, from the way the resourcing of the organization, the resource structure, the way people are brought into the organization and released from the organization, I think you've really, you've got to let go the people that don't fit the mindset or find the mindset painful to them and probably not rewarding. You've also got to remember people are going to get tired out by this as well. So there's an opportunity for the exhausted to leave relatively easily and on good terms. I think there's just so many variables in that it's hard to describe in a few minutes. And maybe we should look at this more, over a period of time. What are the, 10, 20, 50 key aspects to an organization that is able to innovate? Maybe we spend some time going through that on another session.
You want to do that?
I think it's something I pondered a lot. I think I see it in some organizations like Tesla and SpaceX.
There's many good examples where it has worked out very well.
I think for the most part though, people are sort of scared of that organizational structure. There's like an inherent insecurity in that structure. Right. And so it may scare managers and workers off, I guess.
Well, I think it's demanding.
It is very demanding, right?
I've not ego-friendly.
No, that's right. Not ego, definitely.
I mean, the culture in my student groups when I was a professor or a school teacher was. I really encouraged, just out at, no people left their feelings at the door, and you could challenge people. You did it politely, of course, but you could challenge, and it was a very rough and tumble, environment. People were respectful, but if your idea got shredded, it was like, oh well. Mine got shredded all the time. I didn't mind at all because then we got a better idea. I always wanted to have smarter people than me, and that worked out.
Makes your life easier.
I can just sit back and go, I'll take credit for that.
I think there's
on that paper.
I think there's a tremendous amount in that question, and I think it's really worth exploring because it's something I've pondered for a long time, and it's something that personally we're going. We've got a farm business that we're running as well. And so I've been looking at the farm at the moment for probably about 3 months and realizing I'm constrained by the fences that I've put in. Fences are hard to put in. I've put them all in myself. I don't want to pull them out. But, I've been asking myself, what would the structure look like if we took everything we've learnt and turn it into the next generation version, the next edit of the farm? And that's really what you're talking about on a corporate level, right? Is what does the ideal structure look like? And then, using the farming analogy, you're really talking about resourcing your farm appropriately. So, people have preconceptions about stuff. So you want to resource your farm. Okay, so we get a farmer in, we get some cattle people in and some cattle dogs, and get the cattle races set up and the paddocks set up, and it's all looking pretty good at this point. You've recruited your workforce. The only bit you've overlooked is this is a poultry farm that turns out 10 million birds every 35 days, right? you know what I'm saying there. I mean, you're getting the structure of your workforce right to foster the innovation. There's preconceptions in what a workforce looks like.
Yeah, that's a great point. I should have when I introduced you, we should have told people about where you live and I think as you said, it's like 255 acres.
It's a trivial farm by Australia's
standards. By Australian,
like
but it's still
a postage stamp farm. That's what it is. But it's an interesting exercise, and it really grounds. My thought process is I always go, righto, at the end of the day, would this work on the farm?
Yeah.
Right. Would it work on the farm?
So let's do that. So I've got next week, I'm going to have an Oracle colleague, Ron Mayfield, and he's kind of built a really cool model that relates to what we've been talking about today. And it's for he's been using it with big Oracle customers, and he's helping them understand when to use Oracle and when to use Postgres. And so what he does is you can basically put apps, you characterize applications by like availability requirements, size, like 12, I think he's got like 17 factors, and you build these sort of graphs. And then you can kind of graphically see, does it fit within a Postgres model, or does it fit within an Oracle model?
Wow.
And you can try different databases as well.
Nice.
So so it's going to be it's kind of that similar, consider alternatives, but have a process to evaluate. And then I've got another guest, Randy Olinger, after that. So let's shoot for like the end of June. How's that sound? About 3 weeks.
Yeah, 3 weeks, maybe sometime in July, I think.
Or July is fine too.
Yeah.
I know you got a lot going on.
Yeah, we've all got a lot going on, and it might take a little bit of while to think about the all of the dimensions of an organization that is tuned to continuous innovation.
Let's do it.
Continuous innovation.
Great. I know you've been thinking about it. All right, sounds good. We'll be in touch on we'll connect on Telegram and keep that discussion going off online, and then I'll schedule something for July.
Yeah.
So until then, thanks everyone for attending. Yeah, thank you, Ian, for being as usual an amazing guest with great insights. Thanks for sharing that. Mate. Yeah. All right. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks for your time. Really appreciate it, and have a great weekend, mate.
Yeah, you too. Take care. Bye now.
Bye.